Welcome to the Virtual Excellence Show, where we speak to amazing people about all things virtual. So this is a community. We're trying to build a conversation, so we're all learning together along the way. So please do go check out our website, thevx.show, where we have all of our videos, lots of other resources too, building a bit of a conversation there. Use Twitter hashtag #VXShow, and we have a Facebook group where we are having some more extended conversations. But perhaps most importantly, to help us to build the show and make it all happen, please do like the video on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. And that will help us as we're growing along the way. So today we have the very, very interesting Mark Pesce, very old friend, quite similar to myself in many ways, is a futurist, based in Australia, done incredible things over the years. I wrote about his innovation VRML, Virtual Reality Markup Language, in my first book in 2000. And he spoke at one of my Future Media conferences back, I think, 13 years ago, doing all sorts of amazing things, a real pioneer in the space. So let's have the wonderful Mark Pesce on the show. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Ross.
So tell us, 2020, middle of 2020, and it's been an interesting year so far. So what are your observations on what's been happening and how that has taken us into the world of the virtual?
So I guess one of the things that we've learned this year is that we have a forward planning horizon. And as a futurist, we're almost always used to having a forward planning horizon of 10, 20, 30 years. And a client will come and say, tell me what's happening in 5 years. Tell me what's happening in 15 years. And effectively with the pandemic, what happened was as the pandemic growth went exponential, the forward planning horizon disappeared. As one of my friends, Sally Dominguez, who's another futurist, put it so well, she's like, at that point, your forward planning horizon kicks up and becomes a wall and you smash into it. And we're all sort of living in a world now where our ability to plan really effectively into the future is modulating day to day. Here in Australia, we thought we really had it made last month. And now this month, well, Victoria's back in lockdown. New South Wales could be going back into lockdown. The other states are just sort of backing away from us as if we're infected. And so everywhere you're seeing this unprecedented degree of uncertainty. And so now it's clear that navigating through highly uncertain conditions is probably the key skill that people can have because it allows them to function flexibly no matter what their forward planning horizon is. And right now in Australia, it's somewhere between a month and a year, depending on where you are.
So one of the things, of course, for this perhaps not wonderful world of uncertainty, but this world of uncertainty, and I've got to say I like uncertainty, is that it's taken us apart. So we've had to connect in all sorts of new ways, and that's something which you've been doing for some decades now. So some have already been well connected for a long time, others are being forced into it. Yeah. And what's your observations of how organizations and people have, I suppose, gone into the virtual? I suppose sometimes better than others.
One of the things that people have already noted about the pandemic is that it acted basically as a push. It shoved things into the foreground that were sort of bubbling along. And one of those things that was bubbling along very well was a transition to a video-first culture. And we are already seeing this because we were all consuming lots of video. Young people, particularly people who are using TikTok and Instagram, are also creating and consuming video. It tends to be a very two-way relationship around that. Now their parents are consuming and creating huge amounts of video through media like this, such as Zoom or Teams or WebEx or whatever it might be. And so you're now entering this culture where our emphasis is not just on text, but in some sense, text is now losing its primacy, not because it's not an important medium for absorbing information, but because we're really trying to do our best to read one another when we can't actually physically be present. And of course, the thing that we're learning is exactly how hard that is, exactly how little of us comes across, even in a moving image, how little of us actually comes across. And this has been historically one of the real driving forces behind the creation of richly interactive virtual and augmented reality worlds, and that it provides a degree of verisimilitude, a degree of presence that we don't get even when we're using real-time video. Because this idea of a kind of Zoom exhaustion that's filling people up after they've spent days on Zoom calls, and I've certainly been the victim of Zoom exhaustion more than once, it's telling us that the media that we're using are okay, they're working, they're doing the job, but they're also deeply depleting us. And so the search is now on for media that will be as replenishing as they are depleting, which is what face-to-face has very much always been about for as long as we've been doing face-to-face, which is as long as we've been people.
Yes, yeah, totally. It's, we used to think of video conferencing as the ultimate, and now we're realizing that we've got a lot better to come. Right? We might come back to that topic. But to that point, you and I are both professional speakers, and we're used to getting on airplanes and getting on stages and having lots of people there and talking about the future. And now we are relegated to speaking on screen, so basically video. And it's kind of, everyone's already on a Zoom screen, so how do you... So love to hear your reflections and thoughts on, continuing to be a speaker, though now a virtual speaker, and how it is we can make that happen, because that, meantime, is where events are at.
Yeah, and I was not expecting the transition to virtual events to be as seamless as it seems to have been. A lot of organizations have really just continued on as they were before, but have moved their events into online fora. And we'll see how long that lasts. But, pretty much from when things started to calm down, I started to get requests to come and give talks over Zoom or some equivalent technology to groups from, anywhere from tens of people to now several hundred people. I did a talk in New Zealand a few weeks ago, and I was talking to 350 people. So it is happening now. And I know we're all looking forward to a time when we're going to be able to do face-to-face events. And in fact, just before we did this conversation, I got my very first booking for an in-person event that will be held in Sydney. But that in-person event is going to have a completely different format than the original event that they've been talking about that was supposed to happen in May, that of course got canceled because of the pandemic and the lockdown. So we don't really know what person-to-person events are going to look like in the future. And frankly, we don't even know what the state of the world is going to be like in November, so whether we're actually going to be able to have that event in physical presence. And so now you see a lot of organizations, in particular professional speaking organizations, trying to understand how to meet the needs of a client, which is to bring people together, to tell them a story, to deliver a message, but also to get them to activate with one another. This is something that you and I are very big on, is bringing people together to build communities of knowledge, because we both know that when people share, they learn from each other. When they learn from each other, they increase their capacities, and then they go out and take those capacities and change the world. And how do you do that if you're not bringing people together? Well, we have Reddit. We have Stack Exchange. We have lots of systems that actually already do this. How do we marry what we're doing here now, having a conversation, with those other systems? How do we play both of those modes? Because characteristically, people have wanted to be in one mode or the other mode. You want to be embodied or you want to be online. This kind of halfway between the two, we don't have a lot of experience in this because we've never needed a lot of experience in this. So now all of us are getting a lot of experience in this. But you take a look, Microsoft did its Build conference in May, at the end of May, for the first time, rather than having 6,000 people in Seattle, because that's where they would normally have it, they had it online, and they had 200,000 people. The same thing happened with Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, with Google I/O. These conferences that were big in-person events are now massive, global, huge events. And all of these organizations are like, wait, why didn't we ever do this before? And of course, it's because we do treasure that one-on-one. So, Russ, I'm going to ask you, how do you think we're going to actually square that circle? How do we get the best of the one-on-one and the massive togetherness we can get online?
So it's a bit frustrating sometimes because I think you often get to invite, okay, want a keynote? And there's a lot more opportunities to design better conferences. And so one of those always things is, okay, we got change. Where's the opportunity? And for me, the opportunity is in far more participation. And yes, of course, in a physical conference, you can ask people, you can get questions from the audience, you can get some response, you can get hands up, and a few other techniques like that. And you bump into people in the coffee lounge. But we all need to be able to create the serendipity of the right connections between people, and also the real constructive conversations. And that's one thing which I really want to say is, how do we get conversations which are not just, oh, that's an interesting conversation, but actually leads to somewhere, which leads to some of the great collaboration platforms, the facilitation platforms. There's Lumio, for example, and a stack of others that are really built around saying, well, how do we get a conversation which gets somewhere? And we need to work with event organizers so that they start to say, all right, we're not just trying to replicate a physical event in digital. And that's what 95% of them seem to be at the moment, saying, okay, well, let's just rethink that. We've got a bunch of people online. Yes, we want some people to stimulate conversation, but let's get those conversations to places they can take somewhere. And I'd love to hear any of your thoughts around any tools or techniques or approaches to get that engagement once you've got a group of people together.
We've already seen the universities, which are also being forced to do something very similar. We don't see a university as being the same thing as a conference, but it's kind of a big, long-running conference, right? And the universities are now being forced online. But the universities had already had the flipped classroom model. So, I might come in and give a guest lecture at the university, but if I were actually teaching a class at university that was running for an entire semester, I would probably just pre-record all of my lectures, get the students to watch them, and then when we had our class time together, it would be Q&A around the content of the lecture. That's the flipped classroom model. It's fairly well established now. Most universities are very well set up to be able to provide the flipped classroom model, and that points to one way of being able to do a conference, which is that, the keynote is important, but the keynote, as you point out, is the start of a conversation that can then generate, that can then produce. And then the question is, how do you put people together in that environment? Perhaps it's similar to what we're seeing on Netflix, where a bunch of people will watch a horror movie together and comment on it on the side channel. It could be as simple as that. But it could also be then that there's a richness of tool and connectivity around there that allow people who do have that serendipity, that do have that great idea, to run away and work on it. And in some ways, that now starts to look a bit like an unconference where people propose topics and then there's space made available and tools made available for them to be able to work on the ideas that they're generating, that they're co-generating together.
Yes,
but you're right. We don't have a lot of ideas on how to do this yet. It's a very interesting time for experimentation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's part of the massive opportunity of today. That's a really interesting idea, as in universities as events or events as universities. And also that comes to me saying, all right, well, let's overlay organizations. Yeah. So part of the classic things, organizations are a bunch of employees who are tasked, given a salary and tasked to work together. Of course, we've gone beyond that to get more virtual participative organizations. And perhaps there is something else around this idea of a participative loose organization. Maybe there's elements of blockchain in that, where people are collaborating to create a value. And then maybe there is a keynote in there. Maybe there is something which looks like an event, but maybe that becomes extended to something where you get a credential or certificate at some points in that thing. So maybe we can blend conferences and universities and organizations into different manifestations of what is the same thing.
And you already see the morning stand-up, which happens in a lot of firms now, particularly if they're doing anything agile, but the stand-up is just being practiced now. And I have now seen people standing up in their home office in front of their board with their Post-it notes on it, because these are the actionables in all the different quadrants. And that this is, in some ways, worked out very well, but we can see that that's just the beginning point. There's this lovely line from McLuhan, which is that the first content of a new medium is the medium that it is obsolescing. And so if we're obsolescing the agile style and the stand-up, well, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to put the stand-up in the agile inside of there. But that then means that you've got attention gathered, and it becomes a place for learning. It becomes a place for credentialing. It becomes a place where things can happen that are more than just the check-in that everyone does need in order to keep themselves synchronized, particularly when they're working at a distance.
Yes. No, I mean, agile methodologies are obviously more intensely relevant today than ever before, which goes to future of work in organizations. Nice big topic. And, we've touched on that, I suppose, in the nature of Zoom and how those are working now. But what are you seeing in the edge of what is unfolding in what organizations are becoming? Either, I suppose, what we think of pedestrian organizations or frontier organizations. Are you seeing anything intriguing?
I think everyone is really just playing a lot of catch up right now, that there's been so much change in workflow and in work style that in some ways organizations are really just grasping that. The thing that I'm deeply aware of is that one of the things that happens invisibly in an organization, it tends to not be highlighted, but it tends to be pervasive, is the amount of mentoring that goes on. So younger people are being mentored by older people, people who have a certain set of skills are mentoring people who are trying to acquire those skills. All of this happens in the background all of the time in every office as people are working through an organization. Part of what I do is I try to actually highlight this invisible process and make it as visible as possible so that people can actually focus on it, can do better at it. But I think at this point, so much of mentoring has always been about being connected physically to someone, that it's not really something that happens via email very well. It has so much to do with the subconscious cues and just the fact that you trust. And, there's this lovely example of the fact that when students are in a classroom and they're studying subject material, if the teacher is in the classroom not doing anything at all, just there in the room, their retention rate goes up. That there's a bit of human magic there that's happening just entirely inside of our own heads that has to do with the nature of what mentoring is. And now the question is, if we can't be as physically present, how do we recover that? Or are we simply going to be stuck with less mentoring, which means we will not be acquiring skills at the clip that we need to deal with the rate of change that we've suddenly started to see?
Yes. No, it strikes to me that this comes back to mutual value creation, which is kind of the model for my model for the economy is our large. But if you're saying within organizations, those relationships, mentor relationships, are obviously creating value for both people by teaching you are learning and gaining. There is mutual value creation, and that comes back to the Reid Hoffman's idea of the alliance. I suppose not just the employee-employer relationship, but between everyone within the organization. How are you creating value together? So those dyads or triads or whatever those groupings of people where they can exchange value, and perhaps that's this whole idea. The Amazon no more than 2 pizzas in a team rule. So maybe it's this idea of getting people together so that you can engage, and I suppose having, even if you don't have the physical, to at least be able to engage virtually so that you can create value together.
Yeah. And create value, and not just create value, but share values. So not only that there's a way to do something, but that there's a right way to do something, or there's a way that's consistent with the culture of the organization. That there's a cultural transmission of values that happens as well. And we can tell because we can walk into an organization that has good values and we can feel it, because we feel better in that organization than an organization that has had a poor or interrupted transmission of values. And again, these are the things that an anthropologist would see immediately when they walk into an organization, but most of us are blind to because they're simply the water that we are swimming in.
So, which goes to raises the question, how do you engender or propagate or create aligned values in a virtual organization beyond what you can do in a physical organization?
Yeah, and again, this is the kind of thing that we're, I think, going to have to learn. I do think for a lot of this, interestingly, a phone call is going to be more important than a video call, that a phone call has a level of intimacy and emotional attachment associated with this. And this, again, goes back to McLuhan, that the video call does not. The video call is in some sense distancing. Even though you're reading more of the person, you're getting less of their heart. And that in sense, values are transmitted via the heart rather than via the head. You can hear when someone's voice goes, I don't know if you should be doing that, or wow, that is really great. You can get the enthusiasm differently. And so I think part of it is coming to an understanding that there are good media choices, good communication choices for certain kinds of communication. Like you wouldn't fire someone over a text message, right? You don't. There are ways to do things and ways not to do things for precisely these reasons. And I feel as though we've gone all in around video connection because that seemed like it was the good, new, shiny thing and offered us the most. But in fact, what we're going to do is find that there's a range of tools that help us communicate the things that we're not saying explicitly, but that we're still intending.
Yes. So this goes back to what Ewan Semple said when I spoke to him on the show about, what are the right tools? Got all of these tools. And so we've got to work out which the right ones. And the only way to discover that is to try, to experiment and to learn. And that's what many leaders are not so good at doing, but which we all need to do as leaders, as individuals, as organizations. Say, okay, well, let's try a bunch of stuff. And maybe it doesn't work, but that's only with ones you find the one that does work.
Right. But leaders also, particularly in our culture, feel very reluctant to betray ignorance, in part because it feels that it disempowers them, but they also feel that it sends a signal to the rest of the organization that the leader is lost and that is a wrong signal to send. And it is for a lot of reasons. But you see this in miniature in the classroom, where you have a generation of teachers who are closer to our age, who weren't really brought up in a technologically overwhelmed culture the way, say, a 30-year-old might have been. And so their use of tools, and particularly in the transition to online learning, which we've seen, they were forced into a massive learning cycle around all of these tools that they basically managed to keep at arm's length because they didn't want to be seen as less masterful than their students in these areas. And this has been, a persistent issue. But it's now, of course, front and center because they have no choice but to use these tools to reach their classes. And so this is very much the sticky edge of what is leadership. Is leadership always looking confident? Or is leadership going, you know what? We don't have the answer. Let's go find out together. Yes.
You were speaking to very, very similar points. And that's the world today, is you can't pretend you know it all because nobody does. And the only way to find out is making some mistakes.
If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that, to quote William Golding, no one knows anything.
Including you and I, Mark.
Yeah. Both of us in the past couple of months have also gone on amazing learning cycles. We're both using media quite, I hope deftly, that neither of us really would have felt very comfortable doing just a few months ago, because we both could see this as the thing we needed to do, both for our business and just as communicators. And so we dived in. And, I did this series called The Next 100 Seconds, and I did 75 videos over the peak of the pandemic. Part of it was just to get me in front of a video camera every day and to then work on my production technique, to get me more familiar with the tools and the ways that I was working so that I could start to figure out how I wanted to speak to people and listen to people through this medium. So some of it is really just, I think, a willingness to go, okay, I don't know if this is going to go well. And if you go back and look at the first day, because I sent it around to a couple of friends and they're like, dude, what are you doing? It's horrible. Get some lights, and I listened to everyone's feedback, as painful as it was, and got better at it. And it feels like everyone is doing that now. Yes.
I just did a post about mentioning that, amongst other things, my first couple of episodes of the show were pretty embarrassing, but it's that's the way you learn, and hopefully getting there. So I've got to ask you about augmented reality, because I think on my little bio thing it said 6 books. I think you got number 7 coming soon.
Yes.
On augmented reality. So I'm, well, there's not much to say. I guess, I'm very keenly following what might happen in smart glasses, what is happening and what might happen in smart glasses. That's really interesting. And, there's a lot of other things. So I suppose pulling it into, the present and where's this sort of short to medium term future, how are we all going to be using AR? Where's it going to take us?
So in the short term, we're already using AR inside of a lot of different smartphone apps. To tie this into the present moment, Pokemon Go, which was sort of the first mainstream augmented reality app, has done a fair bit of redesign work internally, because Pokemon Go is supposed to get you out of the house searching for Pokemon, only that doesn't work if you're in lockdown during a pandemic. So there have been several upgrades so that you can sort of do it a bit more virtually. So they're finding ways to blend the virtual and the real. We're seeing augmented reality being used to pick furniture out, to design your kitchen. So there's a lot of, I guess, very sort of mainstream, straightforward applications. It tends to be a lot easier for people to grasp augmented reality than virtual reality, because it is intensely grounded in the real world, all right? So that everything that happens in augmented reality is happening in the real world plus the augmentation. And you don't really have to teach people that much about how the real world works, because we've grown up in it. You may have to teach them a little bit about how your app works. But again, that's also what we're learning. So what we're seeing is this very rapid cycle. The platforms, both iOS and Android, are developing much better tools. The new generation of the iPad, and it's believed the next generation of the iPhone, will have a LiDAR sensor in them, and this is a time-of-flight LiDAR sensor. So LiDAR allows you to basically create a depth map of a space very quickly. The Face ID on an Apple phone after the iPhone 10 has that same feature inside of it. The Kinect has that same feature inside of it. These devices are sort of fundamental to being able to make augmented reality cheap and effective. The iPad is clearly got one, and it works quite well. They're already using it to be able to map out spaces. So you see there's a lot of core enabling technologies for augmented reality that are becoming commonplace, and because they're being integrated into smartphones, they're getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The original Kinect unit cost around $500, and then it became this tiny little ball that was about 1,000th the size of the original Kinect that was embedded in the top of your iPhone screen. So that tells you the kind of immense transformations that are taking place there. So these enabling technologies are there. I think when you talk about whether we're going to have the mirror shades, the AR goggles that everyone is promising us, you can see all of the rumor mills. Foxconn is presumably producing lenses for Apple to be able to use for testing units. Everyone absolutely expects that Apple is going to release its own glasses sometime in 2022 or 2023. It's pretty clear that Apple sees this as the next place they need to go. Now that the smartphone has essentially conquered the world, they need to basically produce the next world-conquering invention. You can certainly think that Google will follow. Facebook has clearly indicated they will follow. Microsoft already has the HoloLens, which is now being used in the HoloLens 2 for a lot of industrial and commercial activities, because as one of the fundamental features of augmented reality, it allows this idea of digital depth, that you can take the world as it is and then add layers of information on it so that the world speaks to you, so that the world can then guide your behavior with respect to it, because it is informing you what you need to do. And so that's the basic idea here. We're getting better at it. The tools are getting better at it. Are we at a mass market crossover point? No, it's still a couple of years in the future.
I've got lots of more questions to ask about that, but maybe we should save that for when your book comes out.
Which will be in November, Polity Press.
Okay, all right. Keep posted. So to wrap up, you're a futurist.
Yes.
So this is the Virtual Excellence Show about all things virtual. And just love to hear some thoughts around what we've got coming beyond some of the things which you've been pointed to. What's exciting? What's cool? What should we be looking for?
The thing that I am still really excited about, although because it is complicated, it is taking time, isn't so much augmented reality, which is going to happen, but it's what we're going to use augmented reality for. And one of the things that we're going to use augmented reality for is something called videogrammetry, which is this idea that you can capture something in 4 dimensions, so 3 dimensions plus time, and then recreate it in augmented reality. And the very first example of this that I saw was from a company in California called 8i, now defunct, but got a lot of money from people like Steven Spielberg and whatnot to work on this technology. And I was in a boxing match with a coach. So he was showing me, he's a very famous boxing coach. He was showing me how to hold my body, how to throw a punch. And because I was there with him represented in this 4-dimensional representation, so that he was depth image, he was there. And it wasn't just some sort of creepy avatar, it was him captured in the world with me. Immediately, the parts of my brain that are designed to mirror the way other people are, the mirror neurons here, which we have in order to promote a certain sociality so that we can learn from one another, they started to fire. And I started to hold my body in the right pose. I started to sort of feel a certain way. And that was a moment for me when I got, my God, this is the next place that television as a medium is bound to go. That in fact, television, which is this 2D images on a screen, changed the world, but this videogrammetry, which will come to us mostly in augmented reality systems, because virtual reality is too much of an ask for most people most of the time, that in augmented reality systems, it means that we're going to have the real presence of people as part of our experience, not just this little video window. And it ties back into this whole idea of how do we create an effective connection when we can't be physically present. So I'm thinking that one of the outcomes of the pandemic, for as long as we're apart, is going to be a massive acceleration to the creation of technologies of real presence, and that videogrammetry is one of those key technologies.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. This, which goes to, well, not just digital twin ideas, but also this idea of how do we, what are the new worlds in which we will live and interact? And yes, so much more to delve into there. So thank you so much for your time and your insights, Mark. It's a real pleasure to have a conversation. We should do this more often.
I hope we do. It has been an absolute pleasure, Ross. Thank you.
Okay, so we will, if we're not before, we'll come back to you when your book is out. Very much looking forward to that. Have a most wonderful day and catch you soon. Thank you, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you.
So that's the insights from Mark Pesce, futurist, innovator, been doing things in virtual for decades now. So please help us by liking the video if you've liked it, and subscribing to the channel. Go to our website, thevx.show, for more resources. Use the hashtag #VXShow on Twitter, and go to Facebook, where VX Show will find our show and our conversation. Please engage there. So thank you so much for being with us, and have a lovely day.